The icy Chicago wind howled through the granite pillars outside the Drake Hotel, driving frozen sleet against the glass. Inside the private dining room, a heavy silence fell like a lead weight across the polished mahogany table. A thick white envelope slid smoothly toward my plate, stopping inches from my water glass. Richard Vance adjusted his gold cufflink and leaned forward, his eyes burning with predatory satisfaction. He told me there was a cashier's check for $20,000 inside the envelope, a relocation fund, with one non-negotiable condition. I was to pack up my small house, invent a story about failing health, and move to a low-tier retirement home in Florida or Arizona. I was to permanently vanish from my daughter Chloe's life. Sitting right beside him, my son-in-law Marcus did not blink. He swirled his deep crimson wine, looked me dead in the eye, and coldly agreed with his father. He said his new position as CEO of Apex Global required a specific corporate image, and he simply could not afford a father-in-law who looked like a penniless mechanic dragging down his rising status. Sitting in that suffocating room, listening to the man who swore to protect my daughter to sell his soul for vanity, I kept my hands steady on the white tablecloth. They believed they were banishing a poor, helpless old man into the cold. They had no idea that the foundation of their entire world was about to collapse. But to understand how we arrived at this brutal moment of betrayal, we have to go back to where it all began. The freezing night air bit through the thin cotton of my faded canvas jacket as I stepped off the pavement 3 blocks away from the steakhouse. I had parked my rusted pickup truck far down the street to avoid the sneers of the valet staff. I am 68 years old. My hands are rough, my knuckles calloused, and my leather boots are scuffed from decades of hard labor. For 30 years, I worked 12-hour shifts grease-stained beneath the bellies of heavy delivery trucks. To the world, I am Lawrence Weaver, a quiet, retired mechanic surviving on a meager state pension. But behind that quiet front lies a truth I kept hidden for decades. I am the sole architect of Apex Global, a multinational logistics empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. When I stepped back from active management 10 years ago, I placed my 70% majority stake into an executive framework controlled by my private family office. I chose to live simply, tending to my small repair shop and enjoying the quiet rhythm of an ordinary life. My only daughter, Chloe, was the center of my universe. When her mother passed away years ago, I raised Chloe alone inside our modest wooden home. I wanted her to grow up grounded, valuing hard work, kindness, and character rather than the hollow glow of unearned wealth. She grew into a fiercely independent woman, passionate about simple, beautiful things. She opened a small, vibrant flower shop in the neighborhood, spending her mornings surrounded by the sweet, earthy scent of fresh eucalyptus, damp soil, and blooming hydrangeas. 3 years ago, she met Marcus Vance. Marcus was an ambitious young corporate manager with a charming smile and an appetite for status. Chloe fell deeply in love, seeing him as a driven, hard-working man. I saw through Marcus from the very first handshake. I saw the cold calculation in his eyes, the way his gaze lingered on the brand of a watch or the cut of a suit. But Chloe believed in him, and I wanted her to be loved for who she was, not for the massive trust fund sitting quietly in her name. I held my tongue, gave them my blessing, and let her build her own life. Over the last 2 years, the board of directors at Apex Global hired Marcus as CEO, completely unaware of his personal connection to the quiet founder. The moment Marcus stepped into that corner office, the poison inside him blossomed. He began to look at my simple life with open disgust. He treated Chloe's flower shop as an embarrassing hobby, pressuring her to abandon her work and stay hidden inside their downtown penthouse. When Marcus informed us that his parents, Richard and Evelyn, were flying into town to celebrate his latest corporate promotion, he invited me to dinner. The invitation arrived not as a warm request, but as a heavy, forced obligation. I accepted because I needed to see exactly what kind of environment my daughter was living in. Now, inside the private room of the steakhouse, the air smelled of seared ribeye, rich garlic, and heavy, suffocating perfume. Richard wore a custom charcoal suit with a massive gold watch gleaming on his wrist like a weapon. Evelyn sat beside him, wrapped in a silk trench coat, dripping with pearls, her nose turned up in perpetual judgment. They scanned my worn boots and faded canvas jacket with unadulterated contempt. When I arrived, no one stood up. Marcus merely gestured with his wine glass toward the furthest chair at the end of the table. Chloe was not in the room. Marcus had sent her to the lobby moments earlier under the pretext of checking on our dinner reservations. Evelyn leaned across the table, her diamond-covered fingers tapping the wood. She asked about my tiny little house in a tone dripping with condescending pity, before loudly bragging about their upcoming 3-week vacation on the Amalfi Coast. Richard chimed in, swirling his wine and asking mockingly what kind of menial labor I used to do before retiring to my unremarkable life. I kept my voice low and steady. I told him I worked with my hands, managing freight and dealing with trucks. It was the absolute truth. I simply omitted the fact that I owned 10,000 of those trucks. Richard let out a harsh, mocking laugh, sharing a look of absolute superiority with his wife. Marcus flushed dark red, shifting uncomfortably in his seat as if my mere presence were a permanent stain on his reputation. Then came the envelope. Richard slid the thick paper across the table. He stated the terms with brutal, unapologetic bluntness. $20,000 to pack up, move away, and erase myself from my daughter's life. When I turned to Marcus and asked if he truly wanted me to take the bribe, he looked me right in the eye. He told me his corporate stature could not survive a father-in-law who looked like a janitor, and commanded me to take the money and leave. I did not scream. I did not flip the table. Anger is an emotion for the helpless, and I held all the power in the world. I reached out, picked up the white envelope, and smoothly slid it into the inner pocket of my canvas jacket. Richard and Evelyn exchanged a quick, victorious smirk. They believed the poor old man had surrendered to his greed. I stood up slowly, reached into my pocket, and pulled out a single crumpled $10 bill. I smoothed it out with my thumbs and placed it squarely in the center of my plate. I looked directly at Marcus and told him the bill was to cover the cost of my tap water. I turned my back on their satisfied smiles and walked out into the freezing Chicago night. The bitter wind struck my face, but I felt no cold. My spine straightened. My stride lengthened. I pulled out my cell phone, dialed a secure line, and waited as it rang once. Stephen Ross, my lead corporate attorney and primary trustee, answered immediately. I spoke with the quiet, absolute authority of a man going to war. I told Stephen they had taken the bait and ordered him to initiate an immediate, ruthless forensic audit of every single account Marcus Vance had touched since taking office. The hunt had officially begun. The 45th floor penthouse felt like a glass cage in the freezing Chicago sky. Outside, sleet tapped against the windows with a hollow, metallic click. Inside, the vast room smelled of expensive leather, cold marble, and stale espresso. Every piece of custom furniture was sleek, dark, and sharp. Chloe stood by the kitchen island, her hands wrapped around a mug of cold tea. Her flower shop smelled of sweet eucalyptus, damp soil, and blooming hydrangeas. This apartment smelled only of bleach and artificial air. She looked down at the quartz counter. Her reflection looked pale, thin, and hollowed out by months of quiet isolation. Marcus had changed completely over 2 years. The loving man she married had vanished behind a wall of cold indifference. The emotional violence was never physical. It was a slow, freezing rain that eroded her self-worth day by day. First came subtle remarks about her wardrobe, then harsh criticisms calling her flower shop a pathetic hobby that embarrassed him. Eventually, he convinced her to step back from her daily work at the shop. He insisted that a CEO's wife belonged at home. Inside this penthouse, the cage doors snapped shut. Marcus systematically cut her off from her friends. He stopped taking her calls during the day. When he came home late, smelling of heavy cologne and smoke, he greeted her with suffocating silence. 2 weeks ago, the silent abuse turned financial. Chloe tried to pay for a shipment of winter roses, but her card was declined. Marcus had frozen every joint account without warning. When she confronted him, he sat at the dining table, cutting his steak, and told her in a flat, icy voice that she lacked financial discipline. He treated her like an irresponsible child, stripping away her independence piece by piece until she felt entirely powerless. The heavy front door clicked open, shattering the quiet. Marcus walked into the kitchen, his polished Oxfords snapping against the marble floor. He wore his tailored charcoal suit, his silk tie loosened at his throat. He did not greet Chloe. He dropped a thick leather briefcase onto the island counter with a heavy thud. He unzipped the briefcase, pulled out a stack of legal documents, and slapped them flat onto the quartz surface. The white paper looked blinding under the ceiling lights. Chloe looked at the dense legal print at the top of the page. It was an asset transfer agreement. Marcus pointed a manicured finger at the signature line, commanding her to sign immediately. The document demanded that she surrender full legal ownership of her flower shop and the commercial building attached to it. That shop was her late mother's sole inheritance, an untouchable safety net. Marcus wanted to pledge the property as collateral to secure a private loan for an 80-foot luxury yacht his father was commissioning in Miami. Chloe looked up from the paper, her voice trembling. She asked him how he could ask her to sign away her mother's memory for a boat. Marcus stepped closer, invading her space until she could smell the bourbon on his breath. His eyes narrowed into dark slits. He told her she was an ungrateful, pathetic burden. He said her tiny shop was worthless compared to the corporate empire he was building. He leaned in, his voice dropping into a harsh whisper. He told her that if she refused to sign by tomorrow morning, he would file for divorce. He promised to use his corporate legal team to strip her of every penny, ensuring she would leave with nothing and die alone. Chloe stared at the manicured finger pressing against the paper. The familiar wave of panic rose in her chest, but then something snapped inside her mind. The fear evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. She looked at Marcus's sweating forehead and the desperate greed twisting his face. For the first time in 2 years, she saw him clearly. He was not a powerful titan. He was a weak, insecure man hiding behind borrowed suits and cruel threats. She did not scream or cry. She folded her arms and refused to pick up the pen. Marcus cursed, grabbed his briefcase, and slammed the bedroom door shut, locking himself inside. The apartment fell dead silent again. Chloe stood at the island, breathing deeply. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but her hands had stopped shaking. She walked quietly toward Marcus's open laptop, sitting on the study desk, near the hallway. He had left his executive portal logged in. Chloe used her sharp administrative instincts, scrolling through his file history. She pulled up a folder labeled consulting fees. Her eyes scanned columns of numbers, wire transfers, and shell company registries. Millions of dollars were flowing out of Apex Global into private accounts registered under the names Richard and Evelyn Vance. She saw forged vendor invoices and unauthorized reserve transfers. Marcus was bleeding her father's company dry to fund his family's fake luxury lifestyle. Chloe pulled a small black USB drive from her purse, plugged it in, and copied every financial folder, transfer log, and forged invoice. When the green bar reached 100%, she pulled the drive out and slipped it deep into her coat pocket. She walked into the closet, packed a single duffel bag with her practical clothes, and put on her boots. She did not leave a note. She walked out of the penthouse, leaving the key on the counter. The elevator carried her down to the street level. She stepped out into the freezing night. Sleet stung her cheeks, but she felt alive for the first time in years. She pulled into the driveway of her father's modest wooden house, saw the warm yellow light glowing in the workshop window, and stepped out into the cold air. She walked up the wooden porch steps and knocked firmly on the door, ready to take back her life. The warm yellow light of Arthur's workshop smelled of cedar sawdust, motor oil, and hot black coffee. Outside, the freezing Chicago wind held against the wooden planks, but inside, the air was steady and grounded. Chloe sat at the scratched workbench, staring at the black USB drive resting in her palm. The panic that had consumed her for 2 years was entirely gone. In its place was a sharp, cold determination. She took off her pale coat, pulled her hair back into a tight, neat bun, and opened her notebook. She was no longer hiding behind a gentle smile. She spent the next 48 hours reviewing columns of bank statements, mastering financial terms, and analyzing corporate transfer logs alongside Stephen Ross, her father's lead corporate attorney. Stephen sat across from them, his encrypted laptop glowing under the overhead lamp. He plugged in Chloe's USB drive and initiated a full forensic audit using an independent team of investigators. Within hours, the digital paper trail revealed the staggering scale of Marcus's betrayal. Marcus had systematically bypassed board oversight committees, creating fake consulting firms registered under Richard and Evelyn Vance's names. He had funneled over $6 million directly out of Apex Global's emergency reserves. $4 million had been wired just 2 weeks prior to secure an 80-foot luxury yacht docked in Miami. The rest funded first-class flights to the Amalfi Coast, designer wardrobes, and luxury vehicles registered in Richard's name. Marcus was bleeding the company dry to buy social status for his parasitic family. Chloe looked at the glowing screen, her face calm and unreadable. She felt no heartbreak, only a profound disgust for the man who had tried to reduce her to nothing. Arthur watched his daughter with quiet pride. He walked to the corner of the workshop, unlocked a heavy iron safe behind a row of hanging wrenches, and pulled out a leather-bound corporate binder. He laid the thick documents on the workbench in front of Chloe. Arthur explained the true structure of Apex Global. He did not merely own stock. He held Class B supervoting shares that granted him 70% majority voting control over every board decision. He had placed those controlling shares into a secure family office managed exclusively by Stephen. The executive board operated daily operations, but Arthur retained the absolute legal authority to freeze assets, overrule the board, and terminate executive officers at any time. He told Chloe he had kept the wealth hidden to protect her from fortune hunters, wanting her to build character and self-reliance through her flower shop. Now, that quiet protection was shifting into an immovable shield. The next afternoon, Arthur walked into Miller's hardware store down the street to purchase heavy organic fertilizer for Chloe's shop. He wore his faded denim jeans, scuffed boots, and a heavy flannel shirt stained with dark earth. As he loaded 50-pound bags onto a metal flatbed cart, a sharp, arrogant voice echoed down the aisle. Richard and Evelyn Vance strolled inside, looking absurd in cashmere sweaters and pristine white loafers. They had wandered into the local store while searching for an upscale garden boutique in the neighboring suburb. Richard spotted Arthur immediately. A cruel, mocking sneer stretched across his face. He walked over, loudly announcing to the cashier that it was fitting to see Arthur hauling fertilizer like a vagrant. He bragged that Marcus was going to completely redefine Apex Global at the upcoming merger gala, erasing every trace of low-class influence. Evelyn stepped forward, her heavy perfume filling the aisle with a sickening scent. She looked at Arthur's boots and laughed, telling him to enjoy playing in the dirt while the real masters of the universe built a lasting legacy. Arthur did not blink or clench his fists. He kept his eyes fixed on Richard's face, treating the insults with absolute silence. Chloe stood 2 aisles away, watching behind a display shelf. She saw her father's unshakable dignity and saw Richard's loud, empty insecurity. She felt a surge of pride for the man who built an empire with his bare hands, and pure contempt for the fools boasting on stolen money. Arthur handed 3 crisp bills to the cashier, grabbed his card, and walked past them without a single word. Back at the workshop, Stephen executed the final tactical maneuver. Using Arthur's majority shareholder authority, Stephen quietly initiated a hard liquidity freeze across all Apex Global executive accounts. Marcus's corporate credit lines were instantly paralyzed. The freeze created an immediate financial panic in the executive suite. To cover his tracks before the merger gala, Marcus was forced into a desperate corner. He executed one final, panicked wire transfer from a restricted reserve account to hide his deficits, creating undeniable, real-time proof of grand larceny. The trap was fully primed. That evening, Arthur walked into his bedroom and unzipped a canvas protective bag inside his cedar closet. He pulled out a bespoke midnight blue suit crafted from fine Italian wool, pristine and unworn for 10 years. It was the armor of the founder. He laid the trousers across the ironing board, pressing sharp, unforgiving creases into the fabric as steam rose into the cool air. Beside him, Chloe stood before the mirror. She put on a sleek, tailored black evening gown that fitted her with quiet elegance. She polished her black heels, brushed her hair until it gleamed, and applied a bold coat of dark red lipstick. The timid, isolated wife was gone forever. Standing side by side in the warm light of the cottage, Arthur snapped the brass lock shut on a heavy leather portfolio containing the forensic audit. The long game of patience was over. The trap was set, and the execution was at hand. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was a cavernous cathedral of glass, gold, and crystal. A massive chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a sharp, glittering light over hundreds of tuxedos and floor-length silk gowns. The air was heavy with the scent of imported orchids, expensive perfume, and seared Wagyu beef. A string quartet played a seamless classical melody in the corner, providing a soothing background for the city's political and corporate elite. To the untrained eye, it was a celebration of corporate triumph. To the trained observer, it was a gilded crime scene. In the exact center of the room, Marcus stood holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne. He wore a tailored charcoal tuxedo that fit his frame flawlessly. He threw his head back and laughed loudly at a joke, his white teeth gleaming under the bright lights. Surrounding him was a tight circle of senior board members and wealthy investors. Marcus was radiating the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. He was playing the visionary chief executive, completely oblivious to the fact that his corporate credit lines had been paralyzed 5 hours ago. A few yards away, Richard and Evelyn Vance strolled through the crowd like royalty inspecting their subjects. Richard aggressively patted the shoulder of a city alderman, leaning in close to whisper a fabricated tale of his financial genius. On his wrist, a diamond-studded gold watch caught the light, a timepiece purchased directly with funds stolen from Apex Global's payroll reserve. Evelyn paraded a massive diamond necklace that glittered against her red silk gown. She introduced herself to the wives of major shareholders, acting as the matriarch of an established dynasty. They were intoxicated by the attention, drinking champagne bought with stolen capital, completely blind to the silent men in dark suits standing near the service exits. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance opened with a sudden, echoing crack that cut through the room. The string quartet missed a beat. The high notes faltered. A ripple of quiet spread from the back of the foyer toward the center of the ballroom. Hundreds of heads turned toward the entrance. Arthur Weaver stepped into the blinding light. He walked with long, deliberate strides, his posture straight, his head held high. The bespoke midnight blue suit pulled perfectly across his broad shoulders, radiating absolute, uncompromising authority. Beside him walked Chloe. She wore a sleek, floor-length black evening gown that clung to her figure with quiet elegance. Her hair was swept up in a flawless bun, revealing her sharp jawline and calm, unreadable eyes. Her lips were painted a bold, dark red. She moved with absolute poise, her black heels striking the polished marble floor with rhythmic, confident clicks. The timid, isolated wife had vanished. In her place stood a woman of supreme confidence and strength. A collective gasp echoed through the room. The senior vice presidents and older board members who remembered the early days of Apex Global went pale. The chief financial officer dropped his wine glass, sending shattered crystal across the floor. The whispers spread like wildfire. The founder had returned. Marcus turned around, an irritated scowl forming on his face, annoyed that his audience had looked away. His eyes locked onto Chloe and Arthur. His brain completely failed to process the image. He saw the Kokai he had insulted in the steakhouse, but the bespoke suit and terrifying aura of power did not fit his reality. He saw his wife, the woman he had threatened to leave penniless, standing beside him like a queen. Richard's arrogant smile melted into confusion. Evelyn's hand flew to her diamond necklace, her mouth dropping open in shock. Before Marcus could speak, Stephen Ross stepped out from the shadows near the stage. The chief corporate attorney walked up the 3 wooden steps to the main platform and approached the silver microphone. He reached out and tapped the metal mesh twice with his index finger. The sharp, amplified thud crashed through the cavernous room like a gunshot. The music stopped instantly. The room fell dead silent. Stephen leaned into the microphone. His voice was a calm, resonant baritone that carried the absolute weight of federal law. He formally announced that he was calling an emergency mandatory shareholder disclosure meeting to order. He stated that under the specific charter provisions of Class B supervoting shares, the majority shareholder holding 70% voting control had exercised his legal right to halt all executive proceedings and address the board. Stephen raised his right hand and pointed a single steady finger directly at Arthur. The vast crowd turned their heads, following the line to where Arthur stood. Arthur did not hesitate. He walked toward the stage, carrying the heavy leather portfolio. Chloe walked right beside him, her gaze fixed on Marcus. They climbed the wooden steps and took their place at the center platform. Chloe stepped up to the acrylic podium. She did not raise her voice. She did not scream. She pulled the silver microphone toward her, her voice ringing out with crystal clarity. She looked directly at the board of directors and announced that the executive leadership had committed a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty. With a single tap on the podium controls, the massive high-definition screens behind the stage went dark. A second later, they lit up with blinding white light. Huge, high-resolution images of offshore bank statements, fake vendor invoices, and shell company registries flooded the displays. Chloe spoke with absolute precision, walking the audience through every transaction. She pointed to the exact dates, the exact dollar amounts, and the fraudulent wire transfers. She showed the $4 million wire used to purchase the luxury yacht in Miami. She showed the receipts for Italian vacations, designer clothes, and luxury cars registered to Richard Vance. The audience stared at the screens in absolute horror. The senior board members physically stepped away from Marcus, as if he carried a contagious disease. Richard turned the color of chalk, shrinking back into the crowd. Evelyn let out a choked gasp, covering her face with her trembling hands. The high society guests looked at Richard and Evelyn with unvarnished disgust. The fake dynasty was violently stripped bare in front of the entire city. Marcus's mind snapped under the crushing weight of public humiliation. He let out a desperate, ragged shout and lunged toward the stage steps. He scrambled up the stairs, his tailored tuxedo pulling awkwardly around his sweating frame. His face was twisted in pure panic. He reached out with trembling hands, trying to physically rip the microphone away from Chloe. He stammered wildly, screaming that the documents were forged, begging the board not to listen. He wept hysterically, tears ruining his perfect makeup, stripping away the last shreds of his fake executive persona. Arthur stepped between Marcus and Chloe, standing like an immovable wall of midnight blue wool. He looked down at the weeping man scrambling on his knees. Arthur leaned into the microphone. His voice was as cold and sharp as a guillotine blade. He announced that effective immediately by the authority of the majority Class B shares, Marcus Vance was terminated from his position as Chief Executive Officer of Apex Global. He was stripped of his title, his authority, and his access. Marcus collapsed onto his hands and knees on the stage floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Arthur raised his right hand into the air. It was a simple, silent signal. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance slammed open against the walls with a thunderous thud. A squad of 12 federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division marched into the ballroom in tight military formation. They wore dark, tactical vests emblazoned with bright yellow FBI lettering. The wealthy crowd scrambled out of the way, climbing over chairs to escape the blast radius. The lead federal agent marched onto the stage. He grabbed Marcus roughly by the shoulder of his tailored tuxedo jacket and hauled him to his feet. The agent twisted Marcus's arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping around Marcus's wrists echoed loudly through the microphone. Marcus shrieked in despair as the cold steel bit into his skin. Down on the floor, Richard tried to bolt toward the kitchen exit. 2 broad-shouldered federal agents stepped out of the shadows, intercepted him, and slammed him against the wall, slapping handcuffs onto his wrists. Evelyn screamed hysterically as a female agent stepped up to her, pulled a legal warrant from her jacket, and unclasped the stolen diamond necklace directly off her neck, dropping it into a clear plastic evidence bag. The federal agents marched Marcus, Richard, and Evelyn out through the main foyer in steel handcuffs. The entire room watched in absolute silence as the parasitic family was escorted out into the freezing night, stripped of their stolen wealth and fake dignity. Chloe stood at the front of the stage beside her father. She looked down at the empty spot where Marcus had wept. Her breathing was slow, deep, and steady. There were no tears in her eyes. There was no anger left in her heart. As the heavy mahogany doors closed behind the federal agents, a profound sense of freedom washed over her. The nightmare was over. She was finally completely free. 6 months dissolved the false illusion of Marcus Vance's kingdom completely. The federal justice system moved with a slow, grinding weight that crushed his remaining arrogance. Facing an avalanche of undeniable forensic evidence, Marcus accepted a federal plea deal for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and racketeering. The judge showed zero leniency toward an executive who had manipulated a corporate trust to steal millions. Marcus was sentenced to 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary in Terre Haute. The transition from a 45th floor penthouse to a concrete cell broke him entirely. He traded his tailored charcoal suits for a stiff, bright orange jumpsuit. The man who used to command executive boardrooms with a snap of his manicured fingers now had to ask permission to use the telephone. His days were strictly regulated by the harsh buzzing of electric alarms and the heavy, metallic slamming of iron gates. He slept on a thin, lumpy mattress against a cold cinderblock wall, surrounded by the deafening echoes of shouting inmates. Every waking hour, the inescapable walls reminded him that his boundless greed had built his own permanent cage. Marcus's conviction was the hammer that shattered Richard and Evelyn's aristocratic illusion. Federal authorities invoked racketeering laws, tracing the stolen capital directly to their doorstep. Federal marshals seized the 80-foot luxury yacht docked in Miami and auctioned it off to reimburse Apex Global's reserves. Tow trucks arrived in the middle of the night, hauling away the imported luxury vehicles from their driveway. Their private bank accounts were frozen and drained to zero by court order. Federal agents boxed up their designer clothes, expensive art, and stolen jewelry, leaving them with absolutely nothing. The loss of wealth was brutal, but the social execution destroyed Evelyn completely. The moment news of the federal indictment hit the morning papers, high society excommunicated them instantly. Their country club memberships were revoked. Invitations to charity galas stopped arriving. When Evelyn tried to call her wealthy friends, every line went straight to voicemail. Women who had drank expensive champagne with her now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. Richard found himself equally isolated. Prominent businessmen who used to play golf with him pretended they had never known his name. Stripped of their stolen assets, Richard and Evelyn were violently forced out of their sprawling suburban home. With no savings and no verifiable skills, they were reduced to the very demographic they had mocked for years. They moved into a cramped, drafty one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of Chicago. The building was old, surrounded by cracked pavement and rusted chain-link fences. There was no marble lobby or private valet. The tiny kitchen featured peeling linoleum floors and a refrigerator that constantly rattled. Evelyn no longer shopped at high-end boutiques. She clipped paper coupons and calculated the cost of generic groceries. At 62 years old, Richard had to swallow his pride and apply for entry-level retail jobs. Store managers looked at his blank resume and dismissed him instantly. Unpaid utility bills piled up on their scratched laminate dining table. Without Marcus to steal for them, the resentment between Richard and Evelyn boiled over into bitter, endless arguments. Evelyn screamed at Richard for being a weak man who failed to provide. Richard cursed Evelyn for pushing Marcus to steal to fund her lavish tastes. Trapped together in a cold, noisy cage, they lived out their days paying the agonizing price for their supreme arrogance. While her former captors sank into ruin, Chloe threw herself into a ruthless, beautiful transformation. She did not sit back and play the passive heiress. She declined a plush executive seat at Apex Global, choosing instead to build a life on her own terms. She enrolled in advanced executive finance courses, mastering corporate governance, risk assessment, and portfolio management. She transformed her mother's small flower shop into Bloom Again, a thriving, ethical floral arts enterprise that partnered with local organic growers. More importantly, Chloe channeled her painful experience into practical action. She established the Bloom Again Foundation, a social initiative operating out of her expanded commercial space. The foundation provided emergency financial literacy training, legal support, and transitional career coaching for women trapped in financially abusive marriages. She hired skilled female instructors, organized workshops, and created a safe haven for those who felt powerless. She taught women how to track assets, build credit, and reclaim their economic independence. Chloe's physical transformation mirrored her inner strength. She ate well, exercised daily, and took complete control of her financial future. She managed her own investment accounts, built a solid personal emergency fund, and took complete ownership of her destiny. She spent her weekends hosting seminars, mentoring young female entrepreneurs, and writing educational guides on financial self-defense. Her voice grew steady, resonant, and inspiring, earning her the deep respect of her community. One crisp autumn afternoon, Chloe stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her new sunlit office above the flower shop. She wore a tailored cream blazer over a dark silk blouse. Her skin glowed with vibrant health, and her eyes reflected a sharp, serene intelligence. She looked at her reflection, feeling no trace of past trauma or resentment. She picked up her leather briefcase, stepped out onto her private balcony, and looked at the bustling street below with quiet, unshakable confidence. She no longer needed a man to define her worth or validate her place in the world. She had rebuilt her life from the ground up with her own hands, completely free, fiercely independent, and ready for the peace she had earned. The crisp autumn air carried the rich, comforting scent of damp earth, dried pine needles, and sweet cedar wood. Golden sunlight filtered through the vibrant canopy of red maple leaves, casting warm, dancing shadows across the weathered wooden steps of the porch. The old neighborhood in suburban Chicago was completely quiet, wrapped in the peaceful rhythm of a slow Sunday morning. Across the narrow street, a neighbor walked her dog through the fallen leaves. A gentle breeze rustled the dry blue hydrangeas lining the fence. There were no flashing cameras, no clinking crystal glasses, and no heavy mahogany doors shutting out the world. There was only a profound, unshakable stillness. Chloe sat on the second porch step, her knees pulled gently against her chest. She wore a soft, thick wool sweater and her favorite faded denim jeans. Her dark hair fell loosely across her shoulders, catches of golden light highlighting her glowing skin. In her hands, she held a warm ceramic mug filled with dark, steaming coffee. She inhaled the rich, roasted aroma, taking a slow, quiet sip. The warmth spread through her fingers and down into her chest. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the soft rustle of the leaves and the quiet chirp of birds in the old oak tree. Her heart beat with a steady, peaceful rhythm. The screen door behind her squeaked softly on its brass hinges. Arthur stepped out onto the porch, carrying his own chipped porcelain mug. He wore a heavy flannel shirt, dark work trousers, and his familiar leather boots. He did not say a word. He walked down the wooden steps and sat right beside Chloe, his broad shoulder resting gently against hers. He set his mug down on the plank, pulled a pair of heavy gardening gloves from his pocket, and reached into a small wooden crate resting near his feet. Inside the crate were fresh, healthy bulbs of winter lilies, their dark green shoots peeking through rich, black soil. Chloe put her mug down beside her father's and picked up a small hand trowel. Together, side by side, they began to work. Their hands moved with a familiar, easy rhythm, digging small, neat holes into the damp soil of the porch garden boxes. The cool, moist earth felt grounded and real beneath Chloe's fingers. There was no need to fill the quiet with empty words or loud explanations. The silence between them was no longer heavy with hidden pain or unspoken fears. It was a warm, comfortable silence built on an unbreakable foundation of absolute truth, deep respect, and restored trust. Chloe paused for a second, brushing a speck of dark soil from her sleeve. She looked out at the sunlit street, her gaze resting on the bright horizon. She thought briefly about the cold penthouse on the 45th floor, the blinding lights of the grand ballroom, and the harsh, weeping face of the man who had tried to steal her mother's memory. But the memory no longer carried a single drop of pain. The anger that used to burn inside her chest had completely evaporated, leaving behind a clear, brilliant space. She felt no lingering urge for revenge, no urge to see her former captor suffer, and no bitterness toward the years she had lost. She realized then that true victory was not the public destruction of her enemies at the gala. It was not the federal handcuffs snapping closed around Marcus's wrists or the total forfeiture of Richard and Evelyn's stolen wealth. True victory was this exact moment right here on the wooden porch. It was the complete, total reclamation of her own soul. True revenge was living a life so vibrant, so meaningful, and so profoundly peaceful that the people who had tried to destroy her simply ceased to exist in her mind. They were merely ghosts fading into the background of a story she had already finished writing. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn brass key attached to a simple leather loop. It was the original key to the old repair shop where he had built his logistics network 40 years ago with his own two hands. He did not offer it as a heavy corporate burden or an obligation to run an empire. He laid it gently on the wooden step between them as a simple, voluntary gift, a symbol of enduring strength, quiet resilience, and unconditional love. He looked at his daughter, his eyes shining with quiet, profound pride. He told her in a soft, steady voice that the world could never give her strength because she had possessed that strength inside herself all along. Chloe looked at the key, then reached out and placed her hand over her father's rough, calloused fingers. A warm, radiant smile spread across her face. She looked up into the golden autumn sky, breathing in the cold, sweet air deep into her lungs. The air tasted of freedom, pure and absolute. She stood up on the porch steps, tall, graceful, and unbowed. She was no longer a victim of circumstances, nor an invisible wife hiding in the shadows of an arrogant man. She was the sole architect of her own destiny, standing firmly on her own feet, anchored by the love of her father and the strength of her own heart. The sun crested the tops of the maple trees, bathing the porch in a brilliant, golden light. Chloe stood in the warmth of the golden hour, looking toward the future with a calm, fearless heart. She knew that true wealth could never be bought with stolen millions, flaunted with diamond necklaces, or measured by the brand of a suit. True wealth was the quiet peace held deep inside a human heart, unshakable, free, and eternal. All shadows must fade before the truth, and every pain is simply the start of a beautiful rebirth. Always remember, the right to write a new chapter of your life is forever in your hands. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below so we know we're walking this journey together. Hope to see you on the next page.